Good morning to everybody, and blessed feast of, I guess it's a memorial technically, of the Queenship of Mary. And when we get one of these kind of feast days, first of all, little history, this was instituted by Pope Pius XII, so relatively recent, in the 1950s, right? And the question can arise, how in the world does the church come up 1,950 years, after the supposed birth of Christ, apparently, and suddenly come up with a doctrine like this? Where in the Bible does it say anything about the Blessed Virgin Mary being the Queen? Has anybody, heard things like that before? And in a certain sense, even my own upbringing, I've never doubted the Queenship of Mary, but I wouldn't have been able to defend it for the longest time because it's like, the church knows what it's doing, and therefore that's good enough for me. Apparently some of you have the same attitude. So, however, now that I am a learned man, wisdom and authority has been granted unto me to reveal to you the mysteries of the kingdom. So here we go. First of all, it is precisely because we don't know the Bible that we say things like that, okay? And this is when Christ does things, he's not just like taking little sections of the Bible out of context. Christ is looking at the entire salvation history globally, and he's constantly pulling things out and bringing them to their fulfillment. So I've got three different points here. Number one is Adam and Eve, okay? It's as usual, we're going to go right back to the roots. When God created Adam and Eve, they were the first two humans, okay? But he created us. I love the way John Paul II put it in one of his Theology of the Body talks. He says, when he created Eve, because she came later, he said, from now on there are two different ways of being human. I always thought that was such a cool way of looking at it. With the creation of Eve, there are now two different ways of being human. Obviously, we're largely similar, but there are distinctions. I'm sorry to shock all of you that have bought into the woke ideology, but there are actually distinctions between men and women, and you don't get to choose, so let that be clear. There are distinctions, and they're intercomplementary. So at the origin of humanity, if you want to look at humanity, it wasn't just enough to look at one. You had to look at the unity of man and woman together in order to truly grasp the fullness of humanity. When Adam and Eve sinned, the fullness of humanity sinned. And therefore, when Christ wants to redeem us, he could have just, being God, he could just simply do it however he wants. But he chose to redeem us in such a way that humanity took part. That's why God chose to take on a human nature, and he wanted the fullness of humanity to be involved in the redemption, which is why the Blessed Virgin Mary, even though everything she does is through Christ her Son, he's the source of all the graces and everything, he wanted to do it with his mother, and he wanted to use her as an instrument so that the fullness of humanity is engaged in this process. Now, when you think about what does it mean to be a king and a queen, well, it basically means you rule. When you are the only two people representing your species at the time, you rule. However, like any parent, we know that parents, in a certain sense, can be analogous to kings and queens, right, within a family, because you have been given by God responsibility and authority to rule. Now, it doesn't mean that your children are not like pets. You can't do anything you want with them because they have human dignity. All right, you can't just be a tyrant within the family. You can do it by power, but you can't do it justly. You can't morally just be a tyrant, right? So in a certain sense, Adam and Eve, because they are the very origin of humanity from which everything came, they were analogously kind of like the kings and queens of all of humanity. And what a great king and queen we ended up with. They done messed it all up. But anyway, I can't really blame them because, I've committed many more sins than they have in the meantime, so there you go. So that's number one, though. Adam and Eve is the origin of this idea of the Blessed Virgin Mary being the queen. Now, the second image in the Old Testament is when Israel did have kings. You remember there was such a thing as polygamy. So if your king has multiple wives, and in the case of Solomon, like up to 1,000, imagine that. If you ever want to see a humorous take on King Solomon, just go back to Huckleberry Finn and see what old Jim had to say about since Solomon wasn't the wisest man. What wise man is going to marry 1,000 women? Can you imagine that one? It's a just saying. So, in the case of the kings of Israel, precisely because there was polygamy, if you are married to, frankly, more than one woman, who gets to be the queen? You got a problem, right? So the way they solved it was actually the mother of the king was the queen. And her position was the queen mother. And if you look, there are references that she had a particular role. And that role, by the way, was to be an intercessor before the king. So if you wanted to get somebody to put a good word into the king, if you managed to get away to the queen mother, she would put in a good word on your behalf, and then he would have to listen. It was actually an official governmental thing, which is why when the Jewish exiles got brought to Babylon, they make sure they spell out the totality of the defeat. They say, okay, the king was dragged off, and all of his court, and his mother, because it wasn't just a side issue. It's not like saying his cousin Rufus was pulled out. Who cares? Because his mother was part of that governmental structure. It's like the totality. It's total destruction. It was total disaster here. So Christ, when he is establishing his church, he is reestablishing the original plan. He is the new Adam. The Blessed Virgin Mary is the new Eve. He is the new King David, if you wish. He's reestablishing and perfecting this kingdom of Israel. And in this kingdom there is a queen who is Queen Mother. And thirdly, we can hearken back to our first reading, which actually is not from the feast day, but it kind of works, so I'm going to go with it. And it is the reading of Ezekiel. And it's talking about when the glory of the Lord comes back to the temple of Jerusalem and fills the temple. Okay, what is the temple? It is the place, well, actually it even says here, this is where my throne shall be, this is where I will set the soles of my feet, here I will dwell among the children of Israel forever. That is the temple. Now, Christ himself is actually the temple. He is the new temple. He made that very clear in John's Gospel. But there are numerous references, including in some of John's writings, like for example Revelation chapter 12, that the Blessed Virgin Mary is considered to be the Ark of the Covenant. What is the Ark of the Covenant? Even within the temple, that was the place where, because of the relics that were contained therein, that was the place where God's presence was said to be. The Blessed Virgin Mary is like the world's first tabernacle. We know that the tabernacle contains the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist, and the Blessed Virgin Mary in her womb carried Christ as the world's first tabernacle. And she is, in that sense, she's analogous to the new temple. She is the Ark of the Covenant within the temple. And if you want to go find Christ, go to where he chooses to dwell. Just like God, you could have said in the Old Testament, well, I don't need to go to the temple. God is everywhere. I can pray to God everywhere I want, which is true. However, God chose to be in a certain place in a certain way in order to give special blessings to people. And if God chooses something, probably a good idea to pay attention. God chose, he doesn't quote unquote need the Blessed Virgin Mary. He made her, for crying out loud. But he chose her to be the instrument. He chooses to dwell in her in a special way. And he chooses to be found in her, which is why the Blessed Virgin Mary, as so many saints have said, is the shortcut to get to Christ. So, here you go. Queenship of Mary. If you don't think it's biblical, now you know. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.